Yes or no?
These types, a trans woman may have a penis. A cis woman would not have a penis. These are silly gotcha games that are just used to get clips on the internet. We can also have.
But this whole language, Mark, this whole language is so ridiculous. I wasn't assigned male at birth. I was born a male, right? And this is the problem. And when you talk about women wouldn't win any medals, and you literally destroy women's sport irrevocably. Done. Gone. So once you assume that we separate the sexes at the Olympics, well, I don't think it's funny, this. I think it's so important. It's fundamental. No, Mark has just done is articulated perfectly that we separate the sexes in the Olympics because men have a physical advantage. But at the same time, he wants trans women to be actually acknowledged as actual women. Therefore, the argument should be they should be entitled to all the same rights as a woman. In other words, she better compete against women. This is the problem.
Ketanji Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, could not answer what a woman is. That's a good rule of thumb. They've gone woke, and it has really hurt them with voters. It hurt them on common sense issues in 2024. And the more schizophrenia they demonstrate on issues like that, the worse they...
Look, I gotta be honest with you guys. Watching the left try to explain what a woman is never gets old. Like, it's genuinely entertaining at this point. And in this one, you're about to watch Marc Lamont Hill do exactly what every progressive does when they get pressed on this. Tie themselves into absolute knots trying to sound smart while saying absolutely nothing coherent. Piers Morgan and Michael Knowles are about to corner this guy so hard on the trans women issue that you can literally watch him scramble in real time. And here's the thing. This isn't just some abstract debate. This cost Democrats the election. Like, actual voters looked at this stuff and went, yeah, I'm out. So pay attention to how he dances around the most basic question in biology. Let's get into it.
If you remember in the last election, in the run-up to the election day, the most successful ad in modern American political history, the New York Times said afterwards, was the 30-second ad about Kamala Harris and the trans issues, ending with Kamala's for they, them, Donald Trump is few. They reckon it moved the needle by 3 points. And yet at the same time, many on the Democratic side were saying, this woke stuff, nobody cares, it's irrelevant, it doesn't cut through, it's all just right-wing hysteria. And I was sitting there in the middle going, no, it does cut through. It does cut through. If you're like a mum with kids in sport, in women's sport, in middle America, you absolutely care about this. And you want to have a candidate that can quite clearly tell you what a woman is. Now, again, I come back to this because to me it became a litmus test of where the left took things. If you can't articulate what a woman is without, as you say, I'm not, look at me, I'm not remotely transphobic. I think trans people exist. They have a right to exist. They have a right to fairness, equality, safety, like you and me. I want the same rights for them that everybody else gets. However, not at the expense of eroding women's rights. And that's why the definition of a woman is so crucially important, because it stops the unfairness and inequality and safety issues that come from when you allow trans women to say we're women and they start trampling on women's rights. That's why it's so important.
Okay. I heard your statement. You articulated quite masterfully. I'm going to ask you if you allow me to respond without interruption. I'll take 20 seconds. There's a difference between saying we disagree on what defines a woman and saying that people who have a more expansive definition are struggling to define what a woman is. We're not struggling to define it. You just don't agree with us. Trans women are women. Cis women are women. They're all women. There are different experiences. There are different stories. There are different contexts. And we have to be, I think, honest about that in applying public policy. But there's no struggle here. If there's any struggle, it's been getting voters to remain focused on the issues that actually matter. I didn't have an issue that Kamala Harris prioritized or paid great attention to trans women's rights. The problem was she allowed the right wing to co-opt the narrative and make it seem like that's all she cared about, that she didn't care about workers' rights, that she didn't care about reparations, that she didn't care about living wages, that she didn't care about Palestinians in Gaza, that she didn't care about Haiti, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no, that's not an issue. And finally, to take this one issue around women's sports, and which is relatively small in terms of its impact on everyday people, and make it seem as if trans people who make up an infinitesimal part of the American public are somehow running through your cities and just doing triple axles and dunks and swimming past all your little girls and ruining their sports dreams is a dishonest narrative. I probably agree with you to a large degree about needing to have a conversation about trans women in sports. I'm open to having that conversation. What I'm not open to doing is making it seem as if trans people are destroying the world, or they're destroying women's rights, or they're undermining women's rights. There's a lot of people undermining women's rights right now, and it ain't trans people. And allowing the right to convince us that that was the big issue in the election is why the Democrats lost. And I don't blame the Republicans for that. I blame the Democrats for not foregrounding the issues that mattered, in addition to this other issue that also matters.
But Mark, I think you just made Piers's
point.
Can a woman have
hang on, Michael, Michael, I will come to you. But just quickly, can a woman have a penis, Mark? Yes or no?
These types, a trans woman may have a penis. A cis woman would not have a penis. These are silly gotcha games that are just used to get clips on the internet. I understand your point.
No, they're not.
You're saying
they're just simple biology. No, it's simple biology. A woman can't have a penis. Full stop.
You and I agree on the biology. The point here is that gender identities are different than sex identities. In other words, gender identity is not a biological construct. So yes, women birth babies. Men have penises. We all agree on that if we're talking about male and female, actually. Males have penises, women have vaginas. We agree with that. We can all agree on that. When we talk about gender, it's not purely about what you're assigned biologically at birth. And so to conflate the two things is to either be ignorant to the actual issue or to be disingenuous. I don't think that you are ignorant. I don't think you're disingenuous.
Is that a man?
Say that one more. Say that again. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, so just following that on is the inverse also true then? So does anyone who has a vagina must be a man then, right?
No, that's not the inverse. That's not at all the inverse. The point here is that biologically, there's male and female. That's a much better question. That would follow more logically than the thing you initially asked. Biologically, if you have a vagina, if you're born with a vagina, you are a female. Biologically, if you're born with a penis, you are a male. Yes, that's not in dispute. What's in dispute is, are our biological, our identities at birth, are our biological identities the whole story? And in a trans conversation, we're saying, no, that's not the whole story. Yes, I was assigned male at birth. Everybody on this panel, ironically, was assigned male at birth. That's not in dispute. What's in dispute is, does that tell the whole story about our identity?
I wasn't assigned male at birth. Hang on.
We can also have.
But this whole language, Mark, this whole language is so ridiculous. I wasn't assigned male at birth. I was born a male. Right, and this is the problem. And when you talk about trans women in sport, the reason it's so important, the reason it's so important is there is a Mark. Let me just finish my point. I interviewed a woman called Betty Yee last week, who is literally a candidate to be governor of California, where I currently am. I have a home here in LA. And she genuinely wants the next Olympics in Los Angeles to be gender neutral. That's what she's endorsing, a gender-neutral Olympics, because she's been so traduced into going along with a lot of what you've just been saying, which trans women are women, therefore it shouldn't matter. You can merge the two sexes, you can have gender-neutral Olympics, and here's what happens when you do that. If you're at a gender-neutral Olympics, women wouldn't win any medals. End. You literally destroy women's sport irrevocably. Done. Gone. So once you assume that we separate the sexes at the Olympics, well, I don't think it's fun.
Okay, wait. Did you hear what he just said? These are silly gotcha games. Dude, asking someone if a woman can have a penis is not a gotcha question. It's literally the most straightforward yes or no question in human biology. And the fact that Mark immediately deflects to, oh, you're just trying to get clips, tells you everything you need to know. He knows he can't answer it honestly without either admitting the entire trans women are women thing falls apart, or without sounding completely insane to normal people watching this. And here's what kills me about this. Mark's actually a smart guy. Like, he's not dumb. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's playing to his audience. He's trying to thread this impossible needle where he can virtue signal to the progressive left while also not completely alienating everyone with common sense. But you can't do both. You literally cannot do both on this issue. Look at how he tries to separate biological sex from gender identity. Males have penises, women have vaginas. We all agree on that. Okay, cool. So we agree on basic biology. But then he immediately pivots to, but gender identity is different. Bro, what? Either words mean something or they don't. You can't just redefine woman to mean anyone who identifies as a woman and then act like that's not completely circular logic. Michael Knowles is about to call this out perfectly in a second, but I just want you to understand what's happening here. Marc is doing the classic progressive move. He's trying to sound reasonable and nuanced while defending a position that is fundamentally incoherent. And the reason this matters so much politically is because normal people, moms in middle America, dads watching their daughters compete in sports, they hear this stuff and they immediately know something's off. They don't need a philosophy degree to understand that you can't have it both ways. And notice how Marc tries to minimize the sports issue. This relatively small issue that affects an infinitesimal part of the population. Yeah, tell that to the girls who lost scholarships. Tell that to the girls who got injured competing against biological males. Tell that to the parents who watched their daughters' records get shattered by someone who went through male puberty. It's not small to them. It's their entire athletic career. But here's the real grift with Marc and people like him. They know this is a losing issue. They absolutely know it. The New York Times themselves admitted the trans ad was the most effective political ad in modern history. It moved the needle by 3 points. That's massive. And yet, guys like Marc are still out here trying to gaslight everyone into thinking this doesn't matter, that it's all just right-wing culture war nonsense. No, dude. Women's sports matter. Women's spaces matter. The definition of woman matters. And the fact that you can't give a straight answer without sounding ridiculous is exactly why Democrats got destroyed on this issue. Watch what happens next when Piers presses him again.
So once you assume that we separate the sexes at the Olympics, well, I don't think it's funny, this. I think it's so important. It's fundamental.
No, I don't think it's funny either. What I think is, I was laughing to myself because
let me finish. Let me finish. We separate the sexes at the Olympics for a reason.
Please finish, but there's a 7-second delay, so I'm not interrupting you. There's just a 7-second delay. I'm telling that to the audience so that I don't look like I'm being rude to you. Go ahead.
I recognize that. You're not interrupting me. There is a very slight delay. I agree. Let me just ask you, though, why do we separate the sexes at the Olympics?
Okay. So I'm going to answer your question, but I'd like to respond to the first part of what you said, which I didn't get to respond to, because, again, you're making a straw man here. I'm not arguing for mixing the sexes at the Olympics. I agree with you that we start to divide sports by sex around middle school because there are some biological, physical differences between people born male and people born female that make it non-competitive for female, those assigned female or those who are identified as females at that point. So no, I understand why we divide people in track or basketball or wrestling. I'm not arguing for not doing that. I'm saying that two things can be true at once. As I said initially, we can have a conversation about trans people in sports, but that doesn't mean that I have to no longer identify trans men as men or trans women as women. We can say trans women are women and have conversations about sports that are different. And you're conflating those two. And every time I dispute your point about gender versus sex, you make a straw man argument about women competing in like the triathlon, which I'm not making.
All right, let me bring in Michael. You've been waiting very patiently here. But it seems to me, Michael, the left get themselves into torturous knots about this issue. They also fundamentally don't understand how it sounds to people listening to this stuff, because it sounds, honestly, it sounds slightly insane. Because what Marc has just done is articulated perfectly that we separate the sexes in the Olympics because men have a physical advantage, but at the same time he wants trans women to be actually acknowledged as actual women. Therefore, the argument should be they should be entitled to all the same rights as a woman. In other words, should be able to compete against women. This is the problem with it. Michael.
Yeah. I think that Marc has just proven the broader political point. Because to what Marc said, he said two things can be true at once. And that's true, but two opposing things cannot be true at once. That violates the law of non-contradiction, which we've known since at least Aristotle. So it cannot be the case. Marc's definition is that a woman is a person who identifies as a woman, but that's obviously a circular definition and therefore completely insufficient.
That's not what I
or
said.
he'll say, hold on, let me just finish.
That's not what I said.
Or he'll say that
No, but that's not my position. I just want to be clear that that's not my position. You're stating is my
A
position.
woman can be biologically a woman, but for legal purposes, a man or something like that. And it's totally incoherent, and it obviously is not persuasive to voters. So getting back to the broader point that Piers opened up with, all he said was, look, if you asked AOC what a woman is, she would tie herself into knots answering. I think this panel, and Mark in particular, has just demonstrated that. And to your point, Brian, yes, I agree that Bernie is generally a non-woke leftist. And he's been very good, actually, on certain issues like immigration, because he's for reducing immigration to help workers' rights. However, I think Mamdani and AOC are manifestly woke, and I think you've just proven the point right here. If they cannot answer, as Ketanji Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, could not answer, what a woman is, that's a good rule of thumb. They've gone woke, and it has really hurt them with voters. It hurt them on common sense issues in 2024. And the more schizophrenia they demonstrate on issues like that, the worse they're.
All right, so let's be real about what just happened here. Marc Lamont Hill got absolutely dismantled. And I don't say that lightly. The man is clearly intelligent. He's a good debater. But he's defending an indefensible position, and it shows. Michael Knowles nailed it at the end when he pointed out the law of non-contradiction. Two things can be true at once, sure, but two opposing things cannot be true at once. You cannot say trans women are women and also say we need to separate sports by biological sex without your entire argument collapsing in on itself. It's basic logic, and Mark knows this. He absolutely knows this. But here's what's really going on, and this is what frustrates me the most about progressives on this issue. They're so terrified of being called transphobic that they will literally tie themselves into knots defending positions they know make no sense. Mark even tried the "I'm open to having a conversation about trans women in sports" line, which is such obvious backpedaling. If trans women are women, full stop, period, end of discussion, then there should be no conversation to have about sports. They should compete with women. Done. But he knows that's electoral suicide, and it's also morally wrong because it destroys women's sports. And Piers was absolutely right to bring up Betty Yee. That's a real person running to be governor of California who wants gender-neutral Olympics. Let that sink in for a second. Gender-neutral Olympics. Do you understand what that would mean? Women would win 0 medals in track and field, 0 in swimming, 0 in basketball, 0 in almost every single sport. Women's athletics would cease to exist as a competitive category. And this isn't some theoretical slippery slope. This is a literal candidate for governor in the biggest state in America openly advocating for this. That's what happens when you let the trans women are women ideology run unchecked. It doesn't stop at pronouns. It doesn't stop at bathrooms. It goes all the way to the complete erasure of women's sports, women's spaces, women's rights. And guys like Mark want to pretend like that's not the logical endpoint of their position. Here's my final point. And I know you guys already understand this, but it needs to be said. The reason Democrats lost on this issue is not because Republicans ran mean ads. It's because normal people have common sense. They know what a woman is. They know biological males shouldn't compete against their daughters. They know this entire ideology is fundamentally about denying reality. And when you ask a simple question like, can a woman have a penis, and you get a 5-minute word salad in response, voters check out. They're done with you. Mark tried to blame Democrats for not messaging better. That's not the problem. The problem is the position itself. You can't message your way out of defending something that makes no sense. Piers and Michael absolutely dominated this exchange. They stayed on point, they didn't let him dodge, and they exposed the entire contradiction at the heart of progressive gender ideology. This is what happens when you actually press these people instead of letting them hide behind academic language and victimhood narratives. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this whole debate. Do you think Mark actually believes what he's saying, or is he just playing to his base? Because I genuinely don't know anymore with these people. Either way, this was a perfect example of why the left lost the culture war on this issue. That's what we do here at MB. We call it out, we break it down, we don't let them get away with the double talk. Stay sharp, I'll see you in the next one.